Joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab for today's workshop. If you have any questions along the way for our presenter, you can type them into the GoToWebinar chat box, likely found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any tech questions, you can type them there as well. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to you, Julia.
Hello, friends. Good morning. I guess good afternoon, maybe, but mostly good morning. So pleased to be here with you today. Given that we just have half an hour together, I'm going to move a little bit fast, but my understanding is you'll receive the slides as well as the recording of this session after the fact. The slides will have my contact information, and I'm always happy to answer questions. So let me go ahead and dive in. A little bit about me. My name is Julia Monaghan, and I lead my own solo organizational development practice, People Centered Change, where I work within the nonprofit and philanthropic centers to support people centered transformation and participatory strategy. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. Um, I am here through the lab's partnership with the Association of Consultants to Nonprofits. So as a network member, I get to participate in opportunities like this. The association is a great place for you to go as nonprofits if you're looking for a consultant to partner with, or if you've got an RFP for some work you're looking to do and you want to make sure that RFP gets lots of eyes on it. So there's links in the deck as well if you want to connect and learn more. So today we are talking about stability planning, which sounds a lot like strategic planning, and it is, but it's meant to help us think about planning for stability when the world around us is moving real fast. And so today, what I'm hoping we can do is offer an alternative to traditional strategic planning that's really focused on driving stability when that feels really hard. And in service of that purpose, together, we're going to talk about what stability planning means, the key areas of focus that I recommend, and walk through how to lead that process within your own organization, which is a tall order for 30 minutes, but here we go. Just to get started, I'm going to ask the team behind the camera to launch our first poll. I'm just curious to see who is in the room with us today. So if you can go ahead and respond to that when it popped up on your screen. Always so fun to watch the numbers go. All right, looks like 3/4 of you have voted. So we've got some executive directors or CEOs in the room, a couple board members, a couple folks who lead HR, a number of folks who lead in the finance or ops side, and then folks who either lead other aspects of the organization or are individual contributors within a nonprofit context. Great. Well, it is so nice to be here in the room with all of you. Thanks for spending your morning with me. One more poll question. When was the last time your nonprofit did any system-wide planning? Is that something you're getting ready to do? Maybe you're in the middle of, maybe you've done something in the last 3 years, more than 3 years ago, or it's not something you've had a chance to do yet. No wrong answers. It just helps me think about where we're all at. Okay, so at least half the group is either in the midst of planning now or has done some planning in the last 3 years. Nobody's gearing up to do any right now. A handful of you more than 3 years ago, and then a number of folks that haven't been able to launch a process like this in their nonprofit yet. Great. Well, hopefully this ends up being helpful to all of you, no matter what stage of planning you're at, whether it's something you apply now to some work you're doing right now or some work you've got coming up in the future. So diving into today's content, I wanted to start with a little bit about why we plan. Why do we go through the process of planning? Um, I think the first and most important thing we achieve with any planning process is to create alignment. We are building a shared vision amongst our staff, our board, our community around what is most important, what we need to do to achieve our goals, and the roles that we play in advancing that work. That's our first reason. Secondly, we plan to drive clarity in how we make choices about what we will and won't do and to help us evaluate trade-offs along the way. We plan to help us ensure that the resources we allocate are moving us in the direction that we want to move in, that move us toward our goals and objectives. And finally, we plan to help us prepare for the steps that are needed to help us achieve our goals. So the really tactical piece of planning. So planning does a lot for us. I'm a big fan of planning as a very type A person. Um, but I also think that this is one of my favorite quotes, and I love to bring it out all the time. Dwight Eisenhower, I believe in a military context, said, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything." And what he meant by that is that it is the act of planning where we get the most value, because it is the planning process where we build alignment, where we create shared vision, where we agree on what's important, where we iron out all the sticky things. And then the plan itself, the product, is often obsolete as soon as it hits the deck, especially in today's context where funding streams, partnerships, community context are shifting so rapidly. And so both planning is important because it achieves all those things on the previous slide, but planning is also, I think, more about the process than the output because the output can become sort of obsolete so quickly. And for me, alignment is that key product from the planning process, building a shared sense of what are we here to do and why, and what are we willing to do to get there. Another thing I want to say about planning and why we plan is I want to talk a little bit about the people in your organization. So, people-centered change is the name of my practice for a reason. I'm really interested in the psycho, emotional, and cognitive experience of people inside nonprofit organizations. And so, there are two things that I think are really important as it pertains to planning and the people in your organization. A good planning process, a good alignment driving process helps to create emotional stability and even optimism, which are both critical drivers of individual and organizational resilience, especially in challenging times like the ones we're in today. So there are two reasons for this. One is that our brains do not like uncertainty. Our brains are wired to thrive when we know what's coming so that our brains can come up with all these nice plans for how it's going to keep us safe in that future. When we don't know what the future looks like, our brains are a little bit more frantic. And so having a plan, communicating what that plan means for people helps to quiet that part of our brains. It's like, oh God, what's happening next and how do I get ready for it? So that's one good facet of planning within that sort of individual psychological, emotional, cognitive context. The other thing I want to talk about is that our brains like control. So I just talked about why we don't like uncertainty. It's because our brains are constantly trying to make sure that we feel like we're in control of our circumstances because control means safety. Our brains are very simple creatures in some ways. Um, and so not only does a plan give us certainty, but a participatory plan, a plan that invites other people into the process, that lets them weigh in on what's important, that lets them bring their expertise and wisdom to the table, also helps to increase that sense of control. I have agency and control over my own destiny. I think both of these things are generally important in creating organizational resilience and sustainability. I think that's even more important in moments like these where things are so uncertain and so unstable feeling that the more certainty and control we can give folks, the more capacity we have to deal with the things that we can't control. And given that there's a lot that we can't control right now, it's great to carve out what we can. So, lots of good reasons why to engage in a planning process. Now, when I think about stability planning, the reason I came up with this concept, which I'm not pretending that I invented this, it just kind of came up in the context of some client work I was doing, but I'm sure other people have landed on this thought too, is gosh, how do you undergo a 3 to 5 year strategic planning process when the world is shifting so fast? I was doing some work with a Planned Parenthood organization, which, in the context of healthcare and Medicaid and rural healthcare and all these things, it is a really hard time to imagine where we're going to be 5 years from now. And it's a really hard time to keep the organization stable. So we decided that what felt most important in that moment was to create a plan that drove stability, that kept the doors open, that kept staff in their roles. Um, and so we built out this process together and it worked really well. And I've worked with it with other clients now. And I think there's a lot of value in centering stability when things are challenging. And so in this process, there are three key areas that we touch on. The first is what work is at our core, getting clear about who we are fundamentally. What is our mandate? Two, answering the question, what does stability mean to us? The answer to this is going to be different for every single organization. And so answering that question for yourself is going to be really key. And then three, what threatens our stability? What gets in the way of us creating stability for our mandate, for our communities, for our staff, and what do we want to do about it? And so for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how do we go about answering these questions. And I'm going to do that through a bit of a process that I'm going to walk us through. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the tension between stability and growth. I worked in the nonprofit sector my whole career. I've been doing this work for 20 years. And in our sector, we are pushed toward more programs, more reach, more impact. That push comes from inside us, I think, in part because we're all here because we want to do good work and we want to create more impact. And so there's an internal drive. But that drive often comes from funders as well, who want us to prioritize new programming versus sustaining existing programming that's working. And so I want to acknowledge that that's hard, that we live in a sector where there's a lot of pressure for us to always be doing the next big, bold thing. And we're not always in a context that really allows for that. And so when we talk about stability planning, I want to acknowledge that there might be moments where doing more and driving stability might actually be at odds with one another. And so sometimes stability planning means we're acknowledging we can't do more right now. We need to put everything we've got toward keeping the ship level, doing what we're already doing, creating stability for our staff, creating stability for the clients that we serve or the communities that we serve. But I just wanted to say that I know that that's hard. Our sector doesn't make that choice an easy one, but that doesn't mean it's not sometimes the right one or even the necessary one. A couple principles I want to name that I think are important to the stability planning process. The first is no trading long-term sustainability for short-term stability. So this is I think a fancier way of saying don't cut off your nose to spite your face. It can be tempting to do short things in the short term that provide some immediate relief, whether it's financial or otherwise, that in the long term might actually hurt our viability. And so trying to be really intentional about those short-term stability choices to make sure that they aren't cutting us off at the knees, I'm using a lot of body metaphors today, in the long term. Second principle is that our decisions should, as much as possible, be data, community, and values driven. Not a surprise, I'm sure, to anybody in the room, but making sure that our decision-making process is really grounded in something so that our decisions feel intentional and purposeful. Getting comfortable with good enough. Again, per my last slide, I think as a sector, we really drive ourselves toward excellent work, and there are good reasons for that. And sometimes we can't be excellent. Sometimes good enough is good enough when everything is hard and we don't have enough funding and we can't do all the things we want to do. And good enough can be enough. And so getting clear about what that looks like for you so that you can recognize it when it's in front of you. And then finally, I think staying flexible and adaptive. If we're doing this in the context of a really chaotic, constantly shifting environment, we know that the plans we come up with today might not be viable tomorrow or next week or next year. And so recognizing that so that we don't feel the sting when we have to change plans, but also figuring out how do we track changes in context so that we know what's changing and how we want to adapt. So with those principles in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the process that you can walk through in your organization. The first step is to get really clear on your core. What is the work that you need to be protecting right now? That in all this noise and all this chaos, what are the things that you want to prioritize? Two, defining stability. What does stability mean to your organization from different vantage points? Meaning, what does it mean from a financial standpoint? What does it mean from a fundraising standpoint? What does it mean from an HR standpoint? What does it mean from a program standpoint? Those are all going to be slightly different answers. Having all of those answers is what matters. 3, identifying the critical risks and threats to stability, both the ones that you see coming down the road that you know are coming, but also to do some hypothesizing as to what might happen. And then finally, to set achievable priorities. What can you start to do to move towards stability in your organization? Achievable is key here, going back to the idea of good enough. When things are already hard, setting really bold goals that are really hard to achieve and then not achieving them can be really hard on organizational resilience. So this is a time to set goals that are not that are easy, not that are not important, but good, hard, challenging goals that you can achieve. So I'm going to walk through this process now step by step, but what I want to name is that this process is rooted in participation. It's rooted in the assumption that A, the people that work in your organization all hold critical insight that are going to help you build a really good plan. And B, rooted in the idea that people the best way to build ownership in something is to bring people into the process of building it. And so if you want a plan that people are going to get excited about implementing, the way that you do that is you involve them meaningfully in the definition of that plan. And so this process is rooted in the idea that you're not doing this alone in an office or in your home office or wherever it is, but that this is a process you bring your organization through. And there's a way you can do that in a day. There's a way that you can do that over the course of 3 months. It doesn't have to be a huge kind of dog and pony show, but there does need to be space for people to meaningfully co-create something. So the steps. Step 1, get clear on your core. This is really about building alignment around the work that your stabilization efforts should be centering. And so I'm borrowing from Jim Collins's Good to Great here, which he adapted for the social sector, where he talks about the work that we do needing to be at the center of mission alignment, your capacity to deliver impact, and what's financially viable. So the unprecedented uncertainty and resource scarcity that we're grappling with means we've got to be really clear and focused about what we do. This might not be the time to test new ideas, to pilot new things, to consider mission expansion. It just might not be the right moment. And so this step in the process is really about getting clear about what are we saying yes to and what are we saying no to. And that might mean saying no to new things, but it might mean pausing or sunsetting some of the things that you are doing that aren't critical to who you are and your mandate and the impact that you're looking to create in these challenging times. Building that kind of clarity, building alignment around who we are, going back to my earlier slides on why we plan, is what helps you move past fast in moments of difficulty because you've already built a shared understanding of this is what's most important for us to do. This is the thing that we're going to prioritize. So I know that 3 months from now, when we say no to that thing, this is why, because I was in that room where we said this was important. The next step in the process is to define what stability looks like. And again, from different vantage points. So stability is going to mean different things to different people in your organization based on their functional role, the level of leadership in the organization, maybe their tenure, maybe whether or not they're in or out of the organization, whether a staff or board or a community member. And so this stage is really about thinking through and talking to the folks on your team to figure out, well, what does it mean from all those different vantage points? So for finance, cash in, cash out might be what stability looks like. For programs and services, it might mean, delivering services to a consistent number of people or keeping 3 specific programs up and running. For HR, it might mean investing in culture so that you're able to move quickly on decisions. Part of what we're doing here is answering the question, stability for who? When we say we want the organization to experience stability, what does that break down into? What does that look like from different perspectives? So I've got some examples here: staff experience, constituent outcomes, operational effectiveness, all of the above. So in this stage, the goal is to start by asking these questions across different aspects of your organization and then bringing that information together to build a single holistic definition. Stability to us means, once you've got that definition, your next step is to identify the risks and threats to stability. So now that we know what stability looks like, what are the things that are going to get in our way? What are the things what are the risks in that? What are the things that we're doing that might not work out the way that we want? They might not succeed in the way that we're hoping. And a threat might be something external that's going to impact us that we see coming down the pipe, or we might hypothesize around. So stage 3 is really about being clear. What are the things that we think we're doing that might not go the way we hoped? And what are we going to do about it if they don't? And what are the things we think might happen in the outside world? They're going to impact us, and how are we going to respond in a way that maintains stability? What are the choices we're going to make in that moment? The more thinking we can do ahead of time, the more we can be responsive in the moment. And the fourth step, set achievable priorities. So at this point in your process, you will have answered these 3 questions. What's the work we should be doing? What does stability mean to us? And what are the risks or threats to stability? Now, through that lens, we get to decide, okay, what do we actually do in response to this information? And so we want to choose achievable priorities related to impact, finances, staff experience, fundraising, whatever it is that we focused on. Now might not be the time for blue sky goals. Now might be the time to focus on what's really possible, what's most within our control. This is also the time to remember that plans are nothing, in that anything we commit to today, we might have to tweak or adjust tomorrow, next week, next month. How will we do that? What information are we going to need to make those decisions? How will we get that information? Who gets to decide? These are times when where you can lay some of that out ahead of time. And then finally, as I said before, this is a place where good enough really matters, where the goals that you set, you want to be things that you can really achieve. And then this slide here kind of lays out a little bit of the process around how you move through that prioritization work. So starting with, what work are we prioritizing? What are we doubling down on? What are we pausing? What does success look like? How are we accounting for risks and threats? Then, based on that, what internal investments are we making? Do we have the internal infrastructure, supports, tools, whatever, to achieve those goals? And if we don't, what are we doing about it? And then what resources do we need to achieve those goals? So this is a process you can move through, again, over the course of the day, over the course of 3 months, depending on how much time and effort you're able to put into a process like this. I've got some questions here on this slide that you can use that help you think about how you prioritize. So again, sustainability versus stability. Is there anything that we're doing that's going to stabilize us now that we think actually might impact our long-term sustainability? If so, is that the right choice? Managing risks and threats. Where do we have the most internal control, and how do we want to use that control? Data-driven decision making. Where do we have the best data, and what are we going to do about it? Where do our values point us? What is the work that we can do, or the choices that we can make that are most values aligned? What decisions can we make that will help us stay flexible? So if I go backwards here, the idea is, once you've collected all this great information through engaging with your staff and reflecting on your own internal processes, you can move through this process to figure out, what are we doing? What do we need to do it? What resources do we need to assign to achieve that? And then these are the questions that we can use to help us think about, what do we say yes to? What do we say no to? So that felt very fast, but I hope this felt helpful. I want to leave a few minutes at the end for folks to answer questions, or to ask questions. And so if you've got a question that you're sitting on, now's the time to drop it in the chat. In the meantime, I am going to drop 2 links into the chat. If you are interested in hearing more about what people-centered nonprofit management looks like, I run a monthly newsletter. Um, it's not long. It has information about free sessions that I lead. You're welcome to join. I'm also running over the summer. I try to figure out new ways to make my work accessible. And so if you took something away from today's conversation and you really want to bring it into practice in your organization, and you want to just sit down and plan that out with me, sit down and think through with members of your team, what would it take for us to do this? What would our specific process look like? How would we adapt this to our context? You can use the QR code on the screen or the link I just dropped in the chat to sign up for some consulting hours with me, where we'll sit down and we'll build that together. And there's more information about that if you click through the link. And even if you're just curious, feel free to reach out directly and I'm happy to answer questions. So on that note, I will pause and see if there's anything that folks have questions about that they'd like answered in their last few minutes.
The only questions that I've seen come in are, okay, here we go. If your organization has put off a big undertaking and now still feels like the right time, even in the midst of all this uncertainty, are there any guidelines to stop the initiative?
So if I'm hearing the question right, it's we've put a lot of time and resources into something that still feels like it's a valuable outcome for us as an organization, but maybe now doesn't feel the right time. Did I get that right?
That's my understanding of it, yeah.
Yeah. So I think you could go back to what we talked about here in terms of how I talk about defining stability for your organization, and you might call it something else. But answering the question of what is most needed for us to do our most critical work today in this environment of uncertainty and instability and some of the chaos that we're living through, what is needed for us to really focus on the things that matter most? And what are the things that are maybe detracting from what matter most that we want to not maybe even say no to, but to say, let's pause this for 6 months or let's pause this for a year so that we're investing our time and efforts where we think it's most critical. So I think the way that I would go about this is starting with the question of what is most important to us in this moment right now, and what do we need to be doing to make sure that our time and energy is focused there? And what does that mean for the things that we put to the side? So I think it's still kind of the same general kind of focus of filtering everything through who do we need to be in this particular challenging moment. Hope that was helpful.
Wonderful. Okay. We want to move. Oh no, hold on. That was the same one. I'm curious about any tips you have around framing this for staff. Change is hard, and when programs they love are potentially going to be sunsetted, how do you go about setting up the conversation for success?
Yeah, I love this question. I think it shows a lot of care, which I really appreciate. I think for me, this is why a participatory process matters so much. Because if you have staff engaged in the different stages of this process, there is no moment where you have to suddenly say, hey, surprise, we're in sunsetting this thing you really care about, because they've seen it every step of the way. Oh, this is how we're defining what's most important to us. This is how we're defining the risks and challenges and threats that we're facing. These are the resources that we have. This is what stability means to us in this moment. And so the answers to those questions, if the answer is we've got to sunset this program I love, I'm still going to have a feeling about that, right? I'm still going to feel that sense of loss, which I'll talk about in a second. But it doesn't. But it means that I understand where that's coming from, and so the frustration that can come with that kind of decision isn't going to be as strong because I get why you had to make that choice. I don't like it, but I get it because I was there every step of the way. I think the other piece of this question is to make space for that mourning. I think in one of the things we don't give enough attention to in change processes is mourning the loss of the things that we're not doing anymore, or the organizations or people that we were. And so giving people space to acknowledge, like, man, it sucks that we're not doing this program anymore. I've been doing this for years, um, and to make that okay to say out loud so that we also have the emotional space to move forward and do the new thing. So I think both of those things are really important.
Wonderful. Um, that is the end of our question, and actually, we are out of time. So I'm going to give our closing statement, but first, Julia, if you want to give any last few words to our attendees.
Yeah, just thank you so much for letting me be part of your morning. I hope you found some of this useful for you in whatever planning moment of planning you're at. And if there's anything that you want to ask about over email, please don't hesitate to reach out. I love being helpful, and so would be happy to be helpful in any way I can.
Amazing. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone. This workshop has now come to a close. If you're interested in receiving the recording and materials from today's workshop, you can download them on the bottom of our free webinar page or email us at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. Thank you so much for participating. And again, thank you, Julia, for educating our community.
My
Bye,
pleasure.
everyone.
Have a great day, folks.